There is a word in this passage that your Bible translates correctly, and there is a word it does not translate at all. Matthew 7:13. You know the verse. Most people do. Enter through the narrow gate. But underneath that sentence, in the original Greek, in the Hebrew world Jesus was actually thinking in, there is something your English translation cannot show you. A word that does not mean what you have been told it means. Not slightly different, completely different. And if you understood what that word carried with it, if you saw what it meant to the people who first heard it, you would stop asking whether you were good enough to fit through the gate. You would start asking a different question entirely. This episode goes behind the sermon, behind the translation, behind the Greek, into the Hebrew world that shaped everything Jesus said, to a pattern that connects a psalm written 6 centuries before Jesus stood on that hillside, to the moment he opened his mouth and said, "Enter." The gate is narrow. By the end of this episode, you may not read this verse the same way again. Because if the Hebrew is right, and we will show you why it might be, the narrow gate is not looking for people who qualify. It may already be looking for you. Picture the hillside, not a church, not a sanctuary with cushioned pews and stained glass, and an organ in the corner. A hillside, Galilee, open air, sometime in the late 20s of the 1st century, when the Roman occupation of Judea was 30 years old, and the people who had gathered around this teacher were not pilgrims on a tour. They were people who had come because something about him was different from everything else they had encountered. He is standing above them, not on a platform, on the ground, slightly elevated, the way teachers in the 1st century positioned themselves when they wanted every person in the crowd to see their face clearly. And he says it, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Most people who encounter this passage arrive at the same conclusion. 2 roads, 2 gates, one wide, one narrow, one easy, one hard. And the point, they assume, is to choose the hard one. Try harder, be more disciplined, sacrifice more. Be serious enough about your faith to take the difficult path when the easy one is right there in front of you. The verse becomes a verse about effort, about moral achievement, about a gate that belongs to the people who really mean it. Preachers have preached it that way for centuries, and there is nothing wrong with that reading, except that it is working entirely in English, the moment you step back into the language Matthew actually wrote, and then behind that into the world Jesus was thinking in when he chose these words. The verse does not get easier. It becomes something different entirely. Matthew wrote this gospel in Greek. The word he used for narrow, the word most readers move past without stopping, is stene. Stene. It comes from a root that describes compression, not difficulty, not moral qualification, not smallness. Compression. The image the word carries is not a door that is too small for a large person. The image is a space that presses in from both sides simultaneously, a channel, a corridor, a passage where the walls are very close, and the only way through is to move carefully, without room for anything extra. Hold that image, because the same Greek root, stenos, gives us a word that appears elsewhere in the New Testament, stenikoria. Paul uses it in Romans 8:35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? Stenikoria is in that list. It gets translated as hardship or distress or anguish. But the word, at its root, describes the condition of being compressed, of being in a tight space with no room to maneuver. of having the walls close in from every direction simultaneously until there is nothing left to do but call out. That is the root family of the word Jesus uses in Matthew 7. Not exclusive, not reserved for the disciplined, compressed. Now ask yourself a question. When you hear the word compressed, when you hear anguish, pressed in, no room left, does that sound like a description of moral achievement? Or does it sound like a description of something that happens to you? That question is the door into the Hebrew world behind this passage. And what we find there is going to change what the gate means. Jesus was a first-century Jewish teacher. He quoted the Psalms. He taught from the Torah. He debated in the synagogues. He lived and breathed and thought in the conceptual world of the Hebrew Scriptures, a world where individual words did not exist in isolation, where every word carried centuries of accumulated meaning inside it, the way ancient soil carries the history of everything that ever grew there. When a first-century Jewish audience heard someone describe something narrow, something that pressed in, that compressed, that constricted, until there was no room left, there was a Hebrew concept underneath that experience. The root tsar. We need to be precise here. We cannot say with certainty that this is the exact word Jesus was thinking of. We do not have a record of this sermon in Aramaic or Hebrew. What we can do, what scholars have done for centuries, is trace the conceptual world behind the Greek and ask what a teacher steeped in the Psalms would have understood when he described the place that compresses. The Hebrew root tsar belongs to a family of words that describes all at once what is narrow, what is tight, what closes in without warning, what brings a person to the edge of what they can hold, and also what crushes, what afflicts, what is the pressure that has no name in English until someone says, "I have no room left, there is nowhere to go." In the Psalms, this word is not metaphor. It is description. It describes real people at the limit of what they could bear. And there is one psalm in particular that stops everything. Before we go further, if this kind of investigation is something you want more of, subscribe. Every episode in this series goes back to the original texts, the archaeology, and the history that most people never encounter. Your subscription is what makes it possible to keep building this. We are grateful you are here. Psalm 118 verse 5. Min ha-metzar karatia, anani ba-merchavya. Out of my narrow place I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me in a broad place. Min ha-metzar, ba-merchav. The Hebrew word in that verse, metzar, is a form of the same root as tsar, the compressed place, the place where the walls have already closed in and there is nothing left to do. And the word for the broad place, rachav, wide, open, spacious, somewhere with room to breathe. Now look at Matthew 7 again. Narrow and wide, compressed and broad. The contrast Jesus makes on that hillside is the exact same contrast Psalm 118 makes 6 centuries earlier, word for word. But look at the movement. The psalm does not say, "Be disciplined enough to reach the broad place." It does not say, "Be serious enough, devout enough, committed enough to deserve the open space." The psalm says, "I was in the narrow place, I called out, and I was brought into the broad." The direction of movement begins with someone who is crushed, not someone who achieved. And if the Hebrew conceptual world behind Matthew 7 includes this psalm, if Jesus is drawing on the same field of meaning that the psalmist was reaching toward, then the narrow gate is not the entrance for people who have earned their way through. It is the entrance that opens from inside affliction. It is the gate that finds the people who have run out of room. And that changes what the Sermon on the Hillside is saying, completely. But before we arrive at what this means, we need to stand at a gate, a real one. In the ancient world, a city gate was not a door. The city gate was the most important location in the entire city. It was where commerce happened, where merchants negotiated and contracts were witnessed in public, where disputes were brought to be resolved, where judges held court. The elders of an ancient Israelite city did not deliberate inside the walls. They sat at the gate. Ruth chapter 4. Boaz calls together 10 elders, and a legal transaction is completed at the gate in front of witnesses. Amos 5:15. Establish justice at the gate. Proverbs 31. Her husband is known at the city gates, where he sits with the elders of the land. The gate was where verdicts were announced, in public, where the whole city could hear. And it was where people arrived. Not as tourists. The people arriving at the gates of ancient Jerusalem came under specific conditions. They came as refugees carrying whatever they could and leaving everything else behind. They came as soldiers returning from campaigns they had not been certain they would survive. They came as prisoners escorted by guards, their destination unknown. And they came as exiles, people who had been away for years and sometimes for entire lifetimes, returning to a city that might not look the way they remembered it, walking through the gate with nothing left of who they had been when they left. The sheep gate, the fish gate, the valley gate, the dung gate. Nehemiah walks through every one of them after Jerusalem's destruction, and every gate is not a landmark. It is a threshold, a place of before and after. A place where the person who emerged was not the same as the person who had arrived. Peter standing in the courtyard, warming his hands at the fire while the trial was happening inside. 3 times they asked him, 3 times he denied it. And the gate he walked back through that night, stumbling into the dark to weep, was not the gate he had imagined. Paul, shipwrecked 3 times, beaten with rods in Philippi, stoned in Lystra and left for dead outside the city walls, writing from a Roman prison that he has learned in whatever state he is in to be content. John on Patmos, exiled, alone, writing to churches he could no longer visit, to people he could no longer reach, describing in extraordinary detail what he had seen from an island. None of them chose the narrow gate as a spiritual discipline. None of them woke up one morning and decided that today they would attempt the difficult option. The gate found them. It found Peter in the courtyard. It found Paul on the road. It found John on the island. And this is what the Hebrew world behind Matthew 7 seems to be saying, not as settled doctrine, not as the only reading, but as the conceptual field that shaped the words Jesus chose. The narrow gate, stena, is the place of compression, of tsar, of min ha-metzar. It is not the entrance for the people who have qualified. It is the entrance that opens when everything else closes. The psalmist called out from that place, and was brought into the broad. Maybe you have spent years trying to find the narrow gate, asking whether you are serious enough, devout enough, committed enough to be among the few. Maybe it has always felt like a gate you had to earn the right to approach. But according to the Hebrew world Jesus lived in, where narrow and crushed and distress all belong to the same root, where Tsar and Metzar and Stenochoria describe the same human experience of having no room left. The narrow gate may not be a test of your discipline. It may be a description of where you already are. And the road that leads to life, that strange, difficult, uncrowded road, may not begin in the moment you decided to be serious enough. It may begin in the moment life compressed everything you thought you could control, and you called out from that place, and were answered. This video was made possible by you. Every episode takes many hours of research, digging through archaeological records, ancient manuscripts, and sources most people never see. If you want to support this work and go deeper, you can join the Hidden Archives on our membership page. Members get access to the full research behind every episode, the sources, the original texts, the details that don't fit in a 20-minute video. It is the unseen layer beneath the unseen Bible. But please, don't feel obligated. Watching this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with someone, that already matters more than you know. We are grateful you are here. There is a word in the first verse of Genesis. The very first word. Not in the beginning, before that. Most English translations fold it into the opening phrase and move on. But the word was there first, and it is not what most people think. Next episode.